Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. It has been said that as King Solomon was building his temple in Jerusalem, Masons learned the secret temple ceremonies and passed them down through the centuries. Over time, it seems like Joseph Smith believed this was true and said that he was restoring true Masonry with the LDS Temple Endowment Ceremony. Is that story true? We're going to find out in our next conversation with historian Cheryl Bruno. She has a new book coming out. It was originally supposed to come out in May of 2020, but there's been some production delays, so it's not out yet. But it will be out this year, and from what I understand, it's going to be a groundbreaking book. So we're going to get a sneak peek at Cheryl's book and learn some really interesting things as we move from King Solomon to the Kirtland era. Check out our conversation. Hey, I just wanted to mention one more thing. The Mormon News Report podcast is an awesome podcast, and they cover the week in Mormon news with a healthy dose of snark and commentary. Join Brant and Jenny every Monday to get caught up on all those news stories that you can stay up to date on the latest Mormon news. So check out Mormon News Report. It's a great podcast. Brant and Jenny are great friends. Now back to our conversation. Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm really excited. We have, I would say, the premier expert on the topic we're going to talk about. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you. I'm Cheryl Bruno.
All right. And you're an expert
on Mormonism and Masonry.
All right. Well, cool. Well, one of the things I always like to do is find out a little bit about my guest's background. Are you a trained historian? I don't think you are. You're just a really good...
No, my degree is actually in physical education and recreation.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. You're the first...
That's what I do for my day job.
All right. Well, cool. And so, where did you grow up? Because you're not from Utah, are you?
No, I grew up in Massachusetts.
Oh.
And I went to college in North Carolina, and that's where I encountered the Mormon Church.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't realize you were a convert.
I am.
Oh, wow.
I joined the church when I was about 19, and a little over a year later, I went on a Mormon mission.
Oh, where'd you go?
I went to Montreal, Canada.
Nice. So, Massachusetts, you must be a Red Sox fan, I hope.
I'm not really a sports fan, but but we love the New England Patriots.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm a big Tom Brady fan too, so that's good. So, well, fascinating. So I know you're working on a new book. Can you tell us a little bit about it and when it's going to be coming out?
I am. I sort of inherited this book. It's called Method Infinite, and Nick Latursky's been working on this book he worked on it for maybe 10 years. And Joe Swick worked on it for maybe 10 years, and I've been working on it for the last 7 years.
So this is like 30 years in the making.
Almost. And
that's amazing.
So it's going to finally be published in May of 2020.
Well, awesome. Well, cool. Well, Masonry, this has been something that I've wanted to talk a little bit about. We've heard that the temple ceremonies are related to Masonic ceremonies, and so I would really like to talk about that. The story that I understand is that, and I think this is what most Mormons hear, so we'll go with the kind of the stereotype, and then you can tell us where that's right or wrong. So the story is that there were some Masons in King Solomon's temple, and they learned the temple ceremonies, and those were corrupted, and then Joseph Smith restored them to their proper frame. Is that a fair framing?
No.
Somehow I knew you were going to say that.
No, the Masons have a legend that talks about King Solomon, and when he was building his temple, he used masonry, but masonry goes, in Masonic parlance, it goes all the way back to Adam, who was a Mason. So they have lots of different legends, and it's not necessarily that they have a temple ceremony per se, but they do have rituals that speak about temple work and King Solomon. And it's said that Joseph Smith borrowed extensively from the Masonic ritual when he formulated the temple ceremony. Okay.
So from what I understand, Masonry doesn't go back to King Solomon's time in reality.
That's just their legends.
That's the legend.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. But is it true that Joseph Smith believed that?
Yes, many people in the United States in the 19th century did believe that that was a true story. But I don't know. history was quite different back then. Truth wasn't like we believe truth is today. It was more of like the George Washington story of when he cut down a cherry tree was a historical story that was told to show that he was an honest man. So it was a legitimate story to tell as a history, and they didn't care whether it was literally true or not. So today we would not use that as history, because whether he was honest or not, we want to know what actually happened.
So one of the things that I understand with Masonry is it really, instead of dating to King Solomon's time, which is like 1000 BC, it really dates to the Middle Ages, which is off by, what, 2,000 years?
Yeah, we're not exactly sure when Masonry as we know it began. We know that in 1717 they had the first Grand Lodge meeting. We have Masonic documents from the 1300s. So we're not real sure when exactly between those two dates it began as we know it today.
So the earliest documents are really from the 13th century? Is that what you said? Or
yeah, about 1300s.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. So does it seem logical that it would go back any farther than that?
No.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And so these first Masons, they weren't Masons of King Solomon's Temple. Can you talk a little bit about the development in the 1300s, as you know it?
Well, we know that they speculated on their working tools. So they had like the square meant, that you were going to square your actions and make them true and honest. So they began to speculate on their working tools, and then instead of, well, do you want the whole story of Masonry? Well, Masonry started as people who were working as stonemasons in the Middle Ages, and they banded together into guilds to help them. And gradually they started having people who supported them financially who were speculative Masons that came in and started being part of the lodges. And so that's when they began to have rituals and rites and speculate on their working tools, and it became more of a Masonic institution as we know it today.
Okay. So, all right. So, really, from the 1300s, it seems like I recall, and I'm not a Masonic expert at all, but I understand there are at least two different versions. There's like the Scottish Rite, and then there's another one. Can you tell us a little about those?
Well, I'm not actually a Mason either.
You're not a Mason either.
So, but yes, we have a Blue Lodge, which has the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, the master mason, and that's what Joseph Smith would be familiar with. The Scottish Rite has up to 32 degrees, and many people think that Joseph Smith was a 32 or 33 degree Mason, but that's not actually true. He only had the 3 Blue Lodge degrees, which go up to Master Mason.
Okay. So he's not of the Scottish Rite. No. Do you know much of the difference between these two groups?
I can't tell you much about the Scottish Rite degrees other than they're based on, there's one that's based on Melchizedek, and they have different scriptural passages that they base the ritual around, and there's many of the rituals. And I'm not a Mason. I don't know. I'm more of a Mormon historian. Okay. So I relate the Mormon story and the Mormon history to Masonic, but since I don't know the rituals very well myself, except for the ones that Joseph Smith would have gone through.
Now, Masonry, if I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, isn't that just for men, or is it? Have they allowed women in?
Yes, there is. Masonry is just for men, but they have co-Masonic groups, which are a little different than Masonic groups, and they allow men and women both to go in, and then they have rites that are particularly for women as well, like Heroines of Jericho is a woman's rite, but then they're sort of presided over by men.
Okay. So as we jump into the Mormon history period, one of the questions I have, I spoke with Dan Vogel a few months ago, and one of the things that he made the case, and I was kind of surprised, was he thought that the Book of Mormon was very anti-Masonic. Would you agree with that, or how do you think?
I would not, and I talk about this a lot in the book that I'm writing. So there are passages in the Book of Mormon that seem to be anti-Masonic, but George Oliver, who was a Masonic writer at the time, had a theory of that there were spurious Masons and there were authentic Masons. And so the spurious Masons were people that had corrupted Masonic rites, and like the Egyptians had corrupt Masonic rites. And so I think when the Book of Mormon is speaking of these secret combinations, that Joseph Smith had in mind these spurious Masonic groups. And so he's talking about spurious Masons, he's not talking about the true Masonry. So while he may have had, even back in the period of time when the Book of Mormon was written, he may have still had a very good perception of true Masonry, but in the Book of Mormon it may have been talking about spurious Masons when it talks about these secret combinations.
So there are some passages in the Book of Mormon that could be interpreted as anti-Masonic? Even if it's this spurious versus the...
Well, it wouldn't have been
Masons?
anti-Masonic, but it would have been talking about groups that were false Masons.
Yeah. Okay. So you would agree somewhat with that?
So, well, yeah, no, I wouldn't agree with it because I don't think it's anti-Masonic. It's anti-Masonic would be speaking against true Masonry and talking about how Masons are just terrible secret combinations that kill each other and rob each other. And but in Joseph Smith's case, he could have still had a very good perception of what true Masonry was, but people that are misusing Masonry were the spurious, the secret combinations that he's talking about in the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Because I want to get into this, and I know Dan's not necessarily a believer, but one of the things that he thought that was very instrumental in the Book of Mormon was this, the William Morgan murder. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so Masonry was very popular in the United States. About 1 in 12 men in the United States, maybe even up to 1 in 8 men in the United States was a Mason at the time, and it was very politically correct to be a Mason, and they a lot of times they would use their political influence of Masonry to get elected, and so it was very influential in the United States. And then about that time, in the 1820s, a man named William Morgan got on the wrong side of the Masons and decided to write an expose. And when he started writing his expose, he was kidnapped, they believed, by Masons, and eventually disappeared, and they assumed that he was murdered by the Masons. And this caused a huge furor in the United States, and people were very against Masonry. They realized, oh, this might have been their secret Masonic oaths that they take, that rather than reveal Masonic secrets, they would, rather be killed. These Masons are actually putting this into real practice. And so it started a big movement, the anti-Masonic movement. And even people who were Masons, many Masons thought that that was so wrong that they left the lodges. So Masonry was pretty much decimated in the United States. And this was in Batavia, New York, which was very close to where the Smiths lived at the time. So they would have had to have been deaf and blind not to know what was going on. They very much knew about the William Morgan affair. In fact, William Morgan was incarcerated at a time, shared a cell with Joseph Smith Sr. when he was put in prison for a small infraction.
William Morgan served in jail with
Joseph Smith
Morgan.
Sr., yes.
Wow.
Yeah, so.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, because that's the other question I have is, I understand Joseph Smith Sr. was a Mason.
We believe he was a Mason.
So we don't have total proof.
We don't have total proof, but we have
strong proof,
yes,
or strong evidence, I should say.
That he was.
So, and then one of Joseph's brothers was a Mason as well?
Yes, Hiram Smith was a Mason. And we do have proof that he was a Mason.
And do we know how far back this goes? Is this before this murder?
Yes.
Okay.
It was about the time of the murder. So I think William Morgan affair happened in 1825, and I believe Hiram Smith paid dues in a Masonic lodge in 1824.
Okay.
So it's right about
And the murder
that
was in
time.
1826?
Yeah,
1825,
26.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly.
So, and I mean, that's interesting. As we look at the founding of our country, I know George Washington was a Mason, and it seemed like at least in, 1776, let's say, Masons were pretty well respected.
Yes.
But it was because of this murder in 1825, 26 that a lot of people, because I think there was even an anti-Masonic party. Is that
Yes,
right?
that's what happened after the Morgan affair. It became a political party known as the Anti-Masonic Party.
Okay. So, so you would say these references to secret combinations in the Book of Mormon would represent a corrupt form of Masonry. That's what you think. Okay. So as we go along here, do we have any indications of how Joseph felt in the 1830s time period, especially
We do, because Masonry was quite influential in Missouri when they had the Danites. And so the Danites were a secret combination that the Mormons formed that were based strongly on Masonry. Some of their oaths that they took as Danites used the exact same language that Masonic oaths had. So that was very influential in Missouri, and I believe in the Kirtland Temple, in the School of the Prophets. We see a lot of influence from Masonry.
You
very
see Masonry in Kirtland?
Yes.
Oh, I'm surprised to hear that.
Absolutely.
Like, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
The School of the Prophets, which met in the Kirtland Temple, had a lot of different Masonic elements to it. Just some of the temple architecture and some of the temple rituals had Masonic language. And that is also...
Because I always thought that was more of Nauvoo type stuff.
It's much more in Nauvoo, but we do see it in Kirtland, and that'll be in our book, so you'll be able to read about that.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And so tell us about your book. Do you know when it's coming out?
It is coming out in May of 2020.
2020, yes. Nice. All right. Well, that's cool. So we're getting a nice preview. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with historian Cheryl Bruno. In our next conversation, we'll find out if Masonic ceremonies were secret in the 19th century. Is that true?
Anti-Masonry, they wanted everyone to know exactly what was happening, exactly what oaths were being taken. And so people of the United States knew. It would be like trying to not know about Batman or something. You just know that because it's cultural, right? If you meet an American that doesn't know who Batman is, you'd think, boy, that person's been in a closet somewhere. And so this was the same way with Masonry. Everyone just knew a lot about it. If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents. And for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without any interruption. If you'd like a paperback version of our transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview. Also, if you'd like to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website, and I'll be able to send you a transcript as soon as they are completed, and click the subscribe button. You can also find our latest information on Facebook.com/GospelTangents, as well as we're on Twitter @GospelTangents. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The link is at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, and you can subscribe there. Also, please give us a 5-star review. If you want to support all of the podcasts as part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, go to lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, and do a search for Dialogue Podcast Network or Gospel Tangents, because, that's a pretty cool one too. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.